Welcome, everybody. We sort of apologize for what happened, but it wasn't really anybody's fault. And I think everybody was pretty disappointed, including Bob, that we weren't able to have him here in person. But you know how employers are, they can be kind of demanding sometimes. So he said he had to be there. And so he's not with us tonight, but he did agree to do the Zoom. And then the other complication was it's like he fell off the face of the earth and I couldn't get a hold of him. So I didn't know if he would be willing to do a Zoom or not. And so it took us about a week and a half. And then I thought, well, I better cancel in case he can't do it. But I'm really glad that he was able to do it. And I'm glad you all are here. And so that's it. We're just going to get started. So enjoy the evening.
Okay, hello, everybody. Thank you, Susan, and thank you to Nikki. Hello, Hershey.
Hey there.
My hometown. So apologies. I had my plane ticket. I
Hang
had
on
the
one
rental car. I had the hotel reservations, everything to come up and see friends and family and speak there. And it's my 34th year as a professor. And I've been at the university here in Florida for 18 now. And it's the first time in 18 years they didn't say yes to my requests. I often miss the beginning of the academic year, but this year, the university is launching a whole new array of initiatives. And I guess as the senior faculty member, they want me to run. I have been this week and I have to all next week and this weekend, a lot of the orientation, faculty development. So just recently, to my horrors, they said, I can't go, I need to be here. And I've been protesting around the clock and it didn't work. So I will reschedule and come back to Hershey as I've done in person a couple of times in the past. So when I do, the first person I'll notify is Susan to let her know that I'll be back. So with that said, I'm an historian and it's obviously my passion. And what I thought we would do is I've talked about a number of topics with you over the years, several of my books, a lot of fun topics in history. But I thought I'd talk about hidden history. That is the history you don't know, the history we think we know, but it's wrong, and how historians go about figuring out fact from fiction. You know, these days we have a lot of alternative facts, and there's a war on truth, a war on history, and everything else. So I think it becomes all the more important. So I came up with several fun examples I thought I'd like to share with you. And with that, let's jump into it. So unraveling history's past. So here's some pictures of some great mysteries in history, which it took us years to figure out. And some of them we still don't know. There's still probably more about Easter Island and Stonehenge we don't know than we do know. There's still a lot about the architecture and construction of the pyramids we don't know. And of course, is events like burning witches at the stake and persecution. Sad to say, we never learn those lessons of history. And here we are in 2024, and political violence and suppression and oppression and bigotry seem to be the law of the land. And the lower left, if you look at the old Earl Sea, there have been periods where, yeah, climate change and a massive lake turned into a desert in a very short period of time. Let that be a lesson for today. But I guess what I wanted to say was history is in some way like being a paleontologist. A paleontologist, as you know, studies ancient life, dinosaurs, T-Rex, for example. Here's the challenge for a paleontologist. The last dinosaur to walk the earth was 66 million years ago. So good luck figuring that out. What's left are just a couple of the hard parts. That would be a tooth, a claw, a bone, and a dried footprint in the Cretaceous mud. So how do you figure out how T-Rex ate, how it mated, how it slept, the growth cycle? How do you figure all this out from a footprint in the Cretaceous mud and a tooth? That's really, really, really difficult. The problem is only the hard parts have survived the last 66 million years. We've lost the soft parts. So for example, we don't know what color T-Rex was because skin is a soft material. That tissue has deteriorated, it's disappeared. So we don't know, did T-Rex have stripes? Maybe a lot of predators do. Did they have spots? Did they have camouflage? I mean, nature seems to work that way. Maybe they had feathers. Um, Paleontologists tell us that T-Rex's bone structure, pelvic structure, is very similar to birds of today. So we just don't know. What color were its eyes? What did it smell like? We don't know because all that soft tissue is gone. What did it sound like? Now, when you watch Jurassic Park, Steven Spielberg kind of guessed that a T-Rex sounds like a locomotive or something, right? And that really scary loud. The answer is the tissues of the throat are gone. We don't know what they sounded like. Wouldn't it be funny if they sounded like a little bird or a chipmunk? Who knows? Who knows, right? So the soft parts are all gone. It's the same with history, only it's not as long ago. So being a historian is like being a detective, only everybody at my crime scene has been dead for 150 years or 300 years, right? So good luck with that. And all we have left are the hard parts. Whereas with paleontologists, you have a tooth, a claw, and a footprint. What historians have is a castle, a cannon, and a crown. But we've lost a lot of the soft parts. Our soft parts would be things like love letters, poems, recipes, musical scores, the games children played. Aren't those the things that make us distinctly human, right? Yes, they breathe life into the human adventure, the human narrative. But we lost a lot of that. That's why, if you're like me, you love history, but you hated all your history classes and history books because it was almost as if they took the people out of history. You know, it's one war and then 100 years later, another war, and then this king, and 50 years later, another king. I always wanted to know, well, what happened in between? But, we're missing most of the love letters. We're missing most of the poems. We're missing most of the musical scores. So that's the big challenge for us, is to try to dig up all that stuff and find it, which brings me to this guy. That's Daniel Boorstin. Doesn't he look like a professor, everybody? Yeah, I'm working on that look. But he was the late great librarian of Congress, and himself quite an historian. And Boorstin had a law, the survival of the unread. He would say the following: basically, 99% of everything that's ever been written is gone. Love letters, poems, books. Think about it. If you take a program from the Hershey Historical Center and you go put it out on that nice lawn and by the garden, and if we come back in 4 or 5 months, it basically has turned into what? Soil. It's degraded. It's, decomposed. Now, that's paper today. Imagine parchment from 200 or 2,000 years ago, which was not chemically treated, processed, refined. That stuff had a really short shelf life. So most of all of that is gone. Moreover, before Ben Franklin invented his lightning rod, almost everything burned at one point or another. So we have lost maybe, Boorstin guesses, maybe 99% of, we just don't know of everything that's ever been written, which means we know maybe 1% of the written record. So we don't know much. There's more we don't know than we do know. So that is, of course, a big problem. If we only have 1% of the books, I argue that we have less than 1% of the love letters, poems, musical scores. Obviously, people would keep a poem or a love letter, but how did they store it? How did it last 100 or 1,000 or 2,000 years, right? Who's going to publish it? How is it? People lived in wooden houses once upon a time where there were holes in the wall, and in the summer you had humidity and it rained and then it burned and insects got into it. Almost none of that has survived history. Musical scores, most people were illiterate who have ever lived. Most people didn't know music, so we didn't have very many musical scores, and a lot of that probably didn't survive history. What we really don't have are women's words. The lion's share of women who have ever lived in any period in history, except right now in Western society, were illiterate. Moreover, because of grotesque sexism, women's opinions, their words, were not prioritized. So think of it this way. Let's say you're a woman and you're a pioneer in the 1800s and you're out in the West. First off, where are you going to get something to write with. It's not like there's a Home Depot or a Walmart down the street, right? You're in the middle of Indian territory, in the middle of nowhere. Where are you going to get something to write with and something to write on, right? That is assuming you're even literate. Even if you do get something to write with or on, how are you going to preserve it in a log cabin, right? And if you do preserve it, how is it going to be preserved for the next 150 years in Harvard's library? And even if it is preserved, what historian is going to write about it? Probably no one, right? So think about it. Let's say you're getting is Dean out there, Dean Weichel, my buddy? Hey, buddy, my friend from high school, who, by the way, was an excellent singer and a great guy. So let's say Dean's going to get his Ph.D. in history at Penn down the road. And Dean tells his professors, I have a brilliant idea for a doctoral dissertation. It's going to tell us a lot, and nobody's ever done it. Now, all the faculty members at Penn are all leaning forward in their chair. And Dean says, here's what I'm going to write about: love letters in the 1700s, or child rearing in the 1600s, or recipes in the 1400s. They're going to throw him out of the program. They're going to say, no, you're not. You're going to write about World War II or the Civil War. That's all we're allowed to write about, it seems like. So in other words, even if a woman does, even if she happens to be literate, even if she does write it, even if it's preserved, who's going to record it today? Because of sexism and because of the way society is? Probably no one. Moreover, how on earth would she find the time to write? Think about raising a family in a log cabin in the 1800s in the middle of nowhere. I mean, no disposable diapers, no supermarket down the street, no alligator Ziploc bags, no microwave. I mean, how it took you all day to maybe get something to eat. Here's something. After 48 history books and 34 years reading, writing, teaching history, here's a little tip for you. Today, we worry about 3 meals a day. I try to eat one because I'm always trying to lose weight, especially at my age. But the norm was maybe 3 meals a week. Yeah, you're lucky if you ate 3 times a week. Taking nothing away from the great people that have served in uniform in the military. I've written, I don't know, 15 books about military history. Here's one thing I learned. We like to say that young men signed up for the military because of pride and country, but most of them signed up because they were hungry. And recruiters used to say, you're going to get a meal every day, warm meal every day. You get meat every day. Some signed up in the winter because they were freezing to death. They're going to give you a big coat. They called it a great coat in military history. They're going to give you a coat. Others signed up for adventure, or they were running from the law, or they were bored out of their mind, or they hated getting up at 4 every day to milk the cows. So that's why people signed up for it. And then they maybe got a meal a day. So anyways, so that's part of Daniel Borston's rule. So what is history? So just as a quick overview for you, history is the systematic study of the past. The problem with history books and classes is they just chronologically, don't they? Every class you ever had, they just chronologically list a bunch of events. It's more than that. It's a narrative of the people. What I like to think of is history should be like a great movie or a great novel or a great opera about an interesting protagonist, where you bring all the triumphs and tragedies and loves and loss of people and put them into the story. That's what I try to do in my books. Historians are prophets in reverse. So we tend to think that we know all about the past, but we don't know anything about the future. I submit it's the other way around. You could probably be as good off guessing where we're going to be in another 6 months or a year than what we were doing 200, 300, 1,000 years ago. So a lot about the past is still quite uncertain. So what do we know about the past? Here's one thing: letters. A lot of you probably have letters from family members or maybe a relative. I know my pop had a letter or two. I think a relative fought for the Union, Pennsylvania, in the Civil War. You keep old letters. So what we have are old letters. But think of this: how reliable are these old letters? Well, let's look at 2 examples. That's the great George Washington there on the left. Here's the good news. George Washington wrote a lot of letters. George Washington became a famous military officer before the Revolution. Therefore, most people that got a letter from him tried to save it. So a lot of George Washington's letters are saved. However, there's a couple problems. Here's one problem. When George Washington died, December 14th, 1799, he left a couple thousand letters. His wife, Martha, Mrs. W., lived 2.5 years past him and died in May of 1802. When Martha died, many of George's letters were gone. We think, historians think, she burned them. That was not uncommon. Martha was really, really private and hated being such a public figure. She once wrote that she was riding to meet him in camp, and out in Pennsylvania, actually, a group of soldiers met her and gave her a 21-gun salute, and crowds cheered. And she wrote a letter back home saying, quote unquote, "It's as if I'm a very great somebody." She hated all the attention. She was very private, but she served stoically during the war. She served stoically during his presidency. She was always there. She was selfless. She worked with the public, sort of like Melania. At any rate, so Martha was very private. So we think Martha probably burned George's letters. When Thomas Jefferson's wife, also named Martha, when she died about 17 years before his presidency, he burned all of her letters to keep it a secret. So here's the problem. We go from several thousand letters when George dies to a lot less, a fraction of that when Martha dies. So here's your question as historians, everybody. Do you think Martha, A, randomly burned the letters, or B, systematically burned the letters? What do you think? My guess is B, right, everybody? I don't think she just willy-nilly threw some in the fire. I think she never returned to their bedroom after he died. She took a small room on the top floor of Mount Vernon. I imagine Martha sitting in front of the fireplace with her signature bonnet on, a shawl, reading these letters. Now, one of the letters there's 157 letters of Martha's that have survived. One of George's letters to Martha, there's only about 3. One of them says that she was, quote unquote, my worthy partner. She was a rock. She was an anchor during the storm. My guess is Martha probably said, oh, that's a keeper. Right, everybody? She's keeping that one. Another letter, George had a neighbor. Her name was Sally Carey Fairfax, and she was the premier salonista of the time. I mean, an invite to Sally's party was like, backstage with Bono from U2 or something. So Sally was the bomb. She was beautiful. She was ridiculously rich. She married Lord Fairfax, as in Fairfax, Virginia, and so forth. And George, as a teenager, had the hots for her. Now, George and Sally became friends. So one of the letters might have been George saying, wow, Sally is so good looking. I can't stop staring. My guess would be Martha said, that one goes in the fire. George, we have letters from him during the war. One letter where he says, I'm nervous. I don't know that I'm up for this. The men aren't listening to me. How are we going to beat the world's greatest military? Think about it. He has a ragtag band of poorly trained farmers and ill-equipped blacksmiths, who are starving. The British have the greatest military in the world. And they blockaded every port. So there's no exports, imports, no moving by sea. How are you going to win? George expresses doubt. Now, that letter survived, but my guess is a lot of those letters, Martha probably said, fire. Other letters, George says, today it was brilliant on the battlefield. I figured that General Howe was going to go this way, so I outflanked him and we crushed his army. Martha says, that's a keeper. So the answer is, we don't know. We don't know which ones Martha kept and which ones she threw away. We don't know what we're losing. You don't know what you don't know, right? We don't know what we're missing. We can only guess. So that's a big problem. Here's another problem. George Washington was not well educated, not well read, and not well traveled. He made one trip out of this country in his life. As a later teenager, he went to Barbados with his older half brother, Lawrence. And he was there for just a few weeks. Lawrence was sick. And George loved to go dancing every night. He was a great dancer, by the way. Ben Franklin and Ben's daughter used to write about how George would dance all night and all the women would line up to dance with him at the parties and almost faint when it was their chance to go up and dance with him. So George was a good dancer. We know in Barbados, he went to, what's that, Bridgetown. He went to the Capitol and went out all night dancing with the local girls. We also know he contracted something when he was there. I'm not going to say what, but in one book about George, I wrote that Washington loved the tropical fruits of the islands. So George was a good dancer, but he wasn't well traveled, wasn't well educated. He was a phonetic speller, which means he would spell phonetic with an F, right, everybody? So he was a phonetic speller. And here's what happens. George Washington wins the Revolutionary War. His enemy, King George III, or as my students on campus call him, KG3. I know. King George III wrote that Washington is the greatest man alive. He did something no one else could do. So Washington has this epiphany. It's more like an, oh my gosh, right? Washington thinks everybody's going to be reading my letters for the next couple hundred years. Then as president, he's doubly worried about it. So here's what he does. He has a Harvard-educated aide named Tobias Lear. And he has a man that's more like a son to him. I talked about this with you a few years ago, named Alexander Hamilton. And I will resist rapping the rest of this lecture, okay? Dean, when I see you in private, we will, okay? So Hamilton and Lear are brilliant. So Washington's worried about his misspelled, angry, phonetically spelled, poor grammar, his letters. So he sends them around to his neighbors, to his former officers, and they collect all of his letters. And they bring it back to Mount Vernon. And with their editorial help, he rewrites them and they redeliver them. Now, I wrote a book on George Washington, and I've worked on Washington with other books. I have a book on the Revolutionary War, blah, 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 blah. I have a book about him building the capital city. So I think I've read every letter Washington's ever written. Now, when I read them, I have a question. Is this the original letter or is it 2.0, the scrubbed one? So I'll call the archivists at Mount Vernon and I'll say, hey, I got a question for you. I got this letter, yada, yada, yada. Is it the original one? And they go, we don't know. What do you think, Dr. Watson? And I go, I don't know. So you know what we do? We don't know. We just don't know. So when I write about historical characters, I use words like it appears, perhaps, probably, it seems, likely. I use a lot of that because we just don't know. Here's the rule I use. It's a simple rule. Could have saved myself all those years in grad school. If the letters are well written, I assume that they were scrubbed by Lear and Hamilton. If the letters are poorly written, that's George. So we just don't know. The machine you're looking at in the top right of the screen, has anybody been to Monticello, Jefferson's home? Yeah, okay. It's amazing. It's well worth the visit. I don't like Thomas Jefferson, by the way. I like George Washington. Never liked Jefferson. But I love going to his home. And that's his copy machine. So Thomas Jefferson, as you know, was a Renaissance man, a universal man. He spoke several languages. He was a biologist, a botanist, a poet, played the viola. I mean, he was a remarkable person. He was also a tinkerer and an inventor. And what he wanted to do is he invented that. If you look at it, you can see two pieces of paper tacked down, right? And then he has two quills connected by a pulley. So when he writes, the other quill writes the same thing. It was the first Xerox machine, basically. Now, so Jefferson did that. He tells us that he did that. It's a great form of record keeping. I mean, Jefferson's a very prominent public man. He needs to know what he said to Madison and what day that letter was written. Here's the real reason he wrote it. Jefferson had a huge ego. He was a megalomaniac, like most of them. He did not trust the people he sent the letters to preserve his genius. So he was going to make darn sure he preserved it for us. You know, I don't know what I'm doing next week. I have a big calendar over here with all this stuff this weekend and next week the university wants me to do. I stay one day ahead. Jefferson literally was thinking, what are people going to say about me in 200 years? So he wanted to preserve his genius. So that's why he did it. But here's the real problem. Jefferson wanted to position himself to look better than he was. So what he oftentimes would do, he would change the date on his letters. So let's say Jefferson was our third president, 1801 to 1809. His Secretary of State was Madison. So let's say in 1805, Madison does something diplomatically that results in a great treaty. What Jefferson would do was, after the fact, he would write a letter, but he would write a letter in future tense. I think I'm going to ask Madison to pursue this treaty. If he does, I think it'll work out the following ways. And then he'd write a date before on the letter. Got that, everybody? So we get one of Jefferson's letters and we're like, oh my God, this guy's brilliant. How did he know the lottery numbers? Right? Yeah. Because he wrote it afterwards and then put the date before. So here's the problem. When I write about Jefferson, I call the people at Monticello or the Library of Congress. And I say, hey, I have one of these Jefferson letters here. I need to know, is it the real one or did he fib and change the date? And guess what they say to me? We don't know. What do you think, Dr. Watson? And I go, I don't know. My view is if he looks human, it's the real letter. If he looks like Nostradamus, it's one that he fudged. Got it, everybody? All right, let's go on. What else do we know about letters? There's one of my heroes, Ben Franklin, talking to another one of my heroes, Alexander Hamilton. So I'm a big fan. They're two of my favorite, maybe my two favorite founders. At any rate, so Ben Franklin was amazing. He was what, the 10th of 17 kids to an uneducated, untraveled candle and soap maker in Boston. It's an extraordinary story. And he turns out to be a printer, a politician, a diplomat, a satirist, a humorist, an inventor, a scientist. Ben Franklin is America's Leonardo da Vinci. Let me be fair. Leonardo was Italy's Ben Franklin, okay? So Ben Franklin was remarkable. So as a young boy, his parents realize he's a genius. And because they have no money and he's the 10th kid and they're uneducated, the only way he could learn letters, as they would say, would be to become a preacher. Now, if anybody knows anything about Ben Franklin, the idea of him as a preacher is a Saturday Night Live skit. So Ben Franklin didn't last at all because he disagreed and he misbehaved all the time. So what they do is they set Ben up to be an apprentice for his older brother, James. So James had a newspaper in Boston. And all of us in this room are old enough to remember when every town had a paper or two and every big city had 3 or 4 papers. Boston had multiple papers. It was one of the key cities of the colonial America, maybe second only to Philly. Therefore, it was very competitive for your paper to work. James ran a small paper. They were struggling. Ben was his apprentice. One day, however, they go out to their printing shop. And if you want to write a letter to the editor today, you'll send an email to the Harrisburg Patriot or the Hummelstown Sun. Are those two things still in existence?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the Hershey Chronicle.
No.
Yeah. Okay. So what they did back then, if you wanted to write an editorial in the James Franklin's paper, you would slip it under the door at night. That's what people did. So Ben and his older brother, James, go to the print shop. They open up the door and there's a letter from an older woman who's a society woman, and she's using the pen name Silence Dogood. And the boys read the letter and it's remarkable. This prominent woman talks about when her family sailed across the Atlantic, they were kidnapped by pirates and her parents were killed. And she became the mistress of the pirate captain. And then she escapes. And now she's a prominent woman and no one knows who she is. So Ben says to James, my gosh, we got to print that. And James says, we can't print that. It's salacious. This is puritanical, early mid 1700s in New England. And Ben says, print it. This is what people want. James reluctantly prints it and thinks they're done. Guess what, everyone? You know, it becomes the talk of Boston. Everybody's talking about Silence Dogood. When the Franklin boys, when the next paper is ready to come out, they can't print enough papers. Everybody wants the Franklin boys paper. So a couple days later, there's another letter slipped under the door. The boys open up the print shop. This letter's great. It talks about which ladies gained weight, who has a terrible hairdo, which women are wearing the same dress. How embarrassing that is, right? And Ben says, you got to print this. And James says, no, this is too much because it's, you know, and Ben says, this is what people want to read. They print it reluctantly and everybody loves it. The letters keep coming. One of them talks about who's sleeping with whom. This is what people really want to read, right? And James is freaked out. Ben's getting a kick out of it. Ben's maybe 14, 13. So James wants to figure out who is Silence Dogood. So he hides all night outside the print shop. Guess who Silence Dogood is? Ben. Ben slipping the letters under the door. This little kid. How did he know? How did a little boy know all this gossip from society women? You know, I still don't understand social, you know, this and that. A lot of times we'll go to a party and my girlfriend will say to me, oh, that person really likes you, or this person can't stand you. And I'm like, really? I just don't get it. So Ben would go to the market, and while there's two ladies with their little, you know, baskets, picnic baskets, putting apples in them, they were gossiping, and Ben would eavesdrop. And he learned all the stuff and printed it. I mean, it's great stuff. So who knows how accurate these letters are or are not. Here's one. That's a Sarah Childress Polk. She's the wife of James K. Polk. Who? He was president in the 1840s. Years ago, when I started my career, this is year 34, so we're going back. I was thinking about what I wanted to do. And one of the things I wanted to do, I love presidential history. So I wanted to write books on the presidents. And I wanted to kind of carve out a little bit of a niche for myself as a presidential historian. I've been lucky that every 3 years or so, they get about 40 leading presidential historians to do all the presidential rankings. And happily, I'm in the group. And it's great. You've got to work with David McCullough, Doris Kearns Goodwin, and Beschloss and Meekum and Gordon Wood, all these heroes. But at any rate, so I wanted to be a, you know, specialist on the presidency. There's good news and bad news. The good news is there's so much material out there. Here's the bad news for me. You have David McCullough and Doris Kearns Goodwin. You know, how can you compete with that, right? So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what book on the presidency could I write that all the greats have missed, and I'll be the guy. And I thought about it and I came up with it. You're allowed to laugh at what I'm about to say. Nobody wrote a book on James K. Polk. So I was going to write the book on James K. Polk. I know. I never wrote the book, so I'm okay. You don't have to turn the Zoom off, Susan. So I thought I'm going to write a book on Polk. Well, actually, here's the deal. Our first 7 presidents were well-known, you know, larger than life. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, another Adams, the Adams family, and Jackson, even though I don't like Jackson. And then starting with number 8, Marty Van Buren, from 8 up to 15, Pennsylvania's own horrendous James Buchanan. You have some of the, not the worst, but some of the worst presidents in history. But right there in the middle is Polk. And Polk is well liked. Polk was in his 40s when he was elected. He's the president that signed a Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that basically stole all of the Southwest for us. He's the president that won the Mexican War. Today we call it the Mexican-American War. He was a manifest destiny guy. The public loved him. I don't like him. So I figured I'd go figure out Polk. So I went to start at Polk's archives to read all of his letters for my book. I found 2 things. One, I didn't like him. So why spend a year with somebody you don't like, right? But 2, I was fascinated by something. I was reading his speeches and some of his public announcements, and in the margins was some just brilliant stuff. Pause here for effect, remove this sentence because Senator so-and-so won't vote for it, yada, yada, yada. Read the article I cut out for you. And I'm reading this and I'm going, wait a minute. Speech writers didn't come around until 100 years later. I'm like, who was Polk's speechwriter? So I stopped working on Polk and tried to figure out this riddle. One of the things I did was match handwriting. You already figured it out. Who was Polk's speechwriter? Mrs. Polk. Sarah Polk was an Eleanor Roosevelt 100 years before the great ER. I mean, she was remarkable. Sarah Childress Polk never had children. And in those day and age, sexist day and age, a woman was defined as a daughter, then as a wife, then as a mother. So without having children, it kind of freed her up, unburdened her. Don't tell J.D. Vance, though. It kind of freed her up so that she made politics her career. In those days, women didn't go to Washington. One, Washington was not the magnificent city that it is today. Two, you had to ride, 100 miles in an open carriage in unpaved roads with no GPS, right? Sarah went to Congress with her husband. They put a chair out for her. She sat in every session. Sarah lobbied senators. She debated ambassadors. She schmoozed the generals. Sarah was Eleanor Roosevelt. She was a remarkable woman. Let me give you some examples. There was a joke back in the 1840s. Whenever Polk would go in public or appear, somebody, usually a lot of people, would stand up. Somebody would always stand up and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, the president and Mr. Polk." I mean, give you some sense. Another joke was everybody would say, quote unquote, "Mrs. Polk is certainly a master of herself, and we suspect of somebody else too." So Sarah Polk was remarkable. So I never wrote the book on Polk because I didn't like him. I ended up writing a book on the first ladies, which Sarah's the one who gave me the idea to do it. And that book did well for me, thank goodness. So what I thought I would do is figure out Sarah Polk. And here's one thing I found out. The women of Washington could not stand her. She was enormously unpopular. So I tried to figure out why. I liked her. She was kind of an Eleanor Roosevelt. Here's an example. Back then you had a calling card. It was sort of like a, your business card, and with your signature on it. And the social mores or norms of the time, if I go to visit Susan and leave a calling card, Susan would have 72 hours to repay the visit. Otherwise, it was a faux pas. Got it, everybody? Guess who never returned the calls? Sarah Polk. Why? She was in Congress. She was in subcommittee, drafting legislation, talking to the generals, watching the military drill. She was too busy. Here's the other thing. When the people came to the White House, after dinner, the men would go to one room to smoke cigars, drink bourbon, and solve the issues of the day. Women would go to the blue room or the red room for scones, tea, and talk of child rearing. I'll let you guess which room Mrs. Polk went to. So the women felt snubbed by her because she was over there pouring the bourbon, debating military strategy. So you can't just trust these letters of all these women that said she was horrible. And I purposely picked this image of her because Sarah Polk has sort of been remembered, if she's remembered at all, as a dowdy, right? When actually she was a dynamo, right? She was a dynamo. The War of 1812. So you're allowed to laugh again, everybody. I wrote a book on the War of 1812. It was my first book that won a National Book Award. And I think it was a sympathy vote. Like, who the hell writes a book on the War of 1812? Let's give this guy a gold medal. In fact, here it is. I was just moving my office around. There you go. It's my dun, dun, dun. There's my Olympics, right? So I wrote a book on the War of 1812. For years, I wanted to write a book on the War of 1812. And my literary agent, a guy named Peter Bernstein, would always say, no, Nobody wants to read it. And every year I'd say, I write a book a year. Every year I'd say, Peter, it's the book. Nope. And I'd say it's fascinating. The War of 1812 is the most bizarre war. Harry Truman, my political hero, used to call it, quote unquote, the silliest damn war we ever fought. It's like the Keystone Cops ran the war. And my students on campus would go, who? And I'm like, Larry, Moe, and Curly. And they go, who? So I have to say the Kardashians. And they go, okay. So I wanted to write a book on the War of 1812 for a couple reasons, but here's the main one. I'm a nerd. Dean, you remember me as the cool football player. Yeah, remember, nerd is the new cool, right? So there are still battles in the War of 1812 that we don't know who won. So I wanted to be the guy. I'm like, I'm going to solve that puzzle. My superpower is archival research. I'm going to figure out who won those battles, right? So I'm digging around and I find in London letters, reports from one of the British generals in Canada. And he said, we won the battle. It was a glorious victory. We killed 150 Americans and only lost 25 guys. And I go, oh my gosh, there it is. That's it. Time to celebrate. I can't wait to put it in my book. Well, a couple months later, guess what? I find the American general's papers and report. Guess what he said? He said the same thing. It was a glorious victory. We killed 150 British and only lost 25 guys. Here's the problem. Someone's lying. Here's my guess. Are you ready? I think they're both lying. Let me give you an example. Let's say, is my pop out there?
Yes.
Yes.
Hey, Pops. So that's General Watson there. Let's say my Pops is a general right now. He's an honorable man, so he wouldn't do this. My Pops is a general in Canada, leading an army. Now, let's say he mistakenly walks into an ambush and his army gets annihilated. Is he going to write a letter back to London saying, boy, did I mess up. I walked into this ambush. My whole army was annihilated. Then he gives it to one of his aides, a lieutenant. That guy gets on a horse and rides across Canada, hoping he doesn't get eaten by a grizzly bear, hoping he doesn't get shot by an Indian, hoping he doesn't fall off a cliff into a river and freeze to death. And they have no GPS. Weeks later, he makes it to Halifax, where he waits for a wooden boat. He gets on the boat and sails across the Atlantic, hoping it doesn't sink. He goes to Portsmouth or Southampton. He has to catch a carriage and ride it all the way to London and make an appointment to see one of the lords. That takes 4 months. So now how far out are we? He gives the letter to the Lord, who looks at it and writes a response. It says, you're fired. And then the guy puts it back in his satchel, takes the carriage back to Portsmouth, gets on the ship, hoping it doesn't sink, goes to Halifax, borrows a horse, and now he has to go find a general to tell him he's retired, General Watson. How do you find General Watson? You can't text him. Where is he? Do you ride around Canada? You find him 3 years later and hand him a note saying 3.5 years ago, you were fired. So here's what I think happened. I think every general in history that lacked honor probably wrote and said, it was a glorious victory. I personally was beating the enemy with my bare hands, all that stuff, and gave it to a lieutenant. Why? Why not lie? Why be honest? History won't know. Your soldiers, most of them are 19, they're half literate, and they may or may not write an account of it. And if they do, who's going to read it or believe them? So I think a lot of these folks blew their own horn and talked about what great generals they were, and history didn't know, unless if some nerdy historian dug up all the letters and outed them. So I guess after the book, here's the answer. We still don't know who won some of those battles. So here's my hero, Harry Truman. Talk about letters you can't trust. So has anybody been to Key West?
Yes.
Yeah, it's great, right? It's just down the road from here. Next time you go to Key West, go to the Truman Little White House and tell them I sent you. I've been on their board for 25 years and I helped renovate the building. I've worked like a dog for them for free for 25 years. My only requirement is one, if anybody shows up and says they're one of my friends, you give them a free VIP tour, and they always do. And two, whenever I'm in Key West, I get to sleep in Truman's bedroom, which is really cool. So at any rate, so many years ago, 20, the executive director of the Truman White House, this is where Harry Truman spent his vacations. Truman really didn't like Camp David, which was Camp Shangri-La under FDR. Eisenhower names it for his grandson after Truman. I know Susan Eisenhower. I'd always say to her, you got screwed. Why didn't you call it Camp Susan or Camp David and Susan? Just David. At any rate, so Truman always went to Key West. He spent 175 days of his presidency on 11 official visits to Key West. He did his work there. Other leaders were there. He figured out he wouldn't run for a third term as president there. Remember, the 22nd Amendment limiting a president to 2 terms did not go into effect until after Truman left office, January 20, 1953. So it was an important site for Truman. So I worked with the director, Bob Walls, and we worked with the Truman Library and the National Archives to renovate the building and preserve everything, preserve all the letters. You're not allowed to take the letters back to Mar-a-Lago. The letters must be preserved. They must be with the National Archives. So we worked doggedly for years. I raised money for them. Anyways, so what we did is I get this phone call from the director one day, Bob Walls. He's almost hyperventilating on the phone. And my first thought was the building burned down because it's really old. And he says, we found boxes upstairs in the attic of hundreds of letters that document everything Truman did every hour of every day during his 170 some days he was there. Can you appreciate, everybody, that this is a treasure trove? This is like putting a shovel in the ground and finding an unknown dinosaur, or going to Egypt and finding a new pyramid or something. To know what the president's doing every hour, it was amazing. So we collected all that. I had my graduate students type it all up. We digitized it. Then the National Archives swooped in and did a professional job of everything. Now it's all preserved. We were one Florida hurricane away from losing all that stuff in Key West. At any rate, so around the same time, we're renovating the White House. So we had a problem because my home state here now of Florida does a horrible job, not only with elections, but with historic preservation. They actually tore out the carpet and wallpaper and threw it away. So, and the company that first put it in went out of business. We only have black and white pictures. So we didn't know what color it was. We want to renovate it, but we want it to be authentic. We want it to match the color. So I had an idea, this was years ago. So we invited 4 of Truman's advisors who were with him in Key West all the time and had them remember what color everything was. While they were there, I asked them, where did he put his poker table? Where was his desk? Where did he put his briefcase? So when you go there today, everybody, it's exactly the way it was when Harry was there in 1948. That's what we were shooting for. At any rate, so I go through all these letters. And at the end of our long 4-day weekend working on this with these 4 living Truman aides, I said, gentlemen, we're sitting at his poker table, drinking old granddad like Truman. I'm not a drinker, but I had some because it was Truman's, and playing poker, which I don't like to play, but because it was Truman's poker table. So we're having a blast talking to these great old guys. I said to them, I have a surprise for you. Bob, the director, found all these letters, and I just went through with my graduate students and we typed them all up. And they're like, oh my God, what'd they say? I said, they said that Truman hardly ever worked when he was down here. And they all go, oh, excuse me. I said the opposite. I'm sorry. I said, Truman worked his butt off when he was down here. And they all went, no, he didn't. I said, yes, he did. He worked around the clock. And they said, when he was in Washington, he was a workaholic. Down here, he goofed. He played poker, drank, slept, walked the beach. I said, no. Truman worked nonstop. So they said, show me. So I said, look here, and you'll see the quote on the screen. I had a letter from 7:30 in the morning. Truman writes, quote unquote, okay, boys, it's time to get some work done, meaning his staff. I said, now look here, that evening at 9:30 at night, Truman wrote, okay, boys, it's time to get some work done. That weekend, okay, boys, it's time to get some work done. A beautiful day, he goes on for a short walk on the beach, comes back, and the first thing he writes, okay, boys, it's time to get some work done. And they all laughed. And I said, yeah, it's true. And then the senior most one of them, George Elsey, who ran the map room during World War II, George Elsey goes, no, no, no. Here's the deal. There was a young naval officer, and George Elsey was a naval commander. A young naval officer, the Key West was a Navy base. If you can probably see that when you go down there. And the Truman home was the commandant's of the base, his private home. So the commandant, the head of the Navy, was freaked out because the president's staying at his house. So he assigned this young officer the task to write down what Truman was doing every hour of the day. The guy had to sleep on a cot outside Truman's bedroom. And if Truman wanted orange juice, the commander told him the answer is freshly squeezed, sir, yes, sir. Everything Truman wants. So what happens is the first day, and these 4 aides are telling me the story, the first day Truman gets there, he looks at him and goes, this is beautiful. Okay, boys, it's time to get drunk with bourbon. And the young aide says, Mr. President, I can't write that down. And Truman says, well, then don't. And the young aide says, but sir, the commander said I have to write everything down. And then Truman says, well, then write it down. The young officer says, sir, I can't write that. The first thing the president does is drink a whole thing of bourbon. And Truman goes, that's what I'm about to do. Write it. And the aide said, sir. And Truman said, well, then write whatever you want. Make it up. So whenever Truman said, let's play poker or drink or goof, the aide would write, it's time to get some work done. So you can't trust the words necessarily. I profess myself a votary to love. Let me do like 2 more or so. So this is a quote from George Washington. George was in the French and Indian War, also known in Europe as the 7 Years' War. And at one of the early battles, the Braddock Expedition, which was in the Wild Wild West, which is today near Pittsburgh, Washington became famous. Newspapers and what they used to call a broadside, kind of like a poster, were written about this. So Washington's with Lord Braddock, and the French and the Indians are seizing Pittsburgh. They build a Fort Duquesne. They're seizing the rivers out there. That's fertile area, eastern Ohio, western Pennsylvania. So they send Washington out there to figure out what's happening, what's going on. And he goes as an aide to General Braddock. Braddock brings a massive army. Now, Braddock marches the army into an ambush. They're going through the woods darn near single file, which is idiotic because the army stretches for a mile, which means if you attack here, they can't reinforce. Braddock doesn't post advanced scouts. Washington's complaining about everything. And of course, the British are what? They're wearing a red uniform with a white cross, like a bullseye. The French and the Indians are hiding in the woods and annihilate the army. 50%, half the British army is killed. It's one of the worst defeats they ever suffered on this continent. Every single officer, including Braddock, is killed. George Washington is a colonial aide, but this is when he becomes George. So for the record, everybody, George Washington was 6'2", broad shoulders, big hands, a powerful man. Hamilton used to love to joke that when Jefferson was around Truman, he would shut up because he was so intimidated. Excuse me, Washington. Jefferson was so intimidated by Washington's size and power. And Jefferson was 6'2". Washington was a beast of a man, a beast on the battlefield. Washington hops on Braddock's horse, draws a sword, and organizes an orderly retreat. You men, lay down fire. You retreat by that road, because the army's being annihilated. The horse gets shot out from under him. Washington gets up, runs, and jumps on a second horse. A bullet goes through Washington's jacket, then a second bullet, and it doesn't hit him. It's like a miracle. One of the other aides, his horse is shot by one of the Indians or French. The horse falls on him. Unlike in Hollywood movies, you don't lift the horse up. The guy's stuck under the horse. An Indian comes by to put a tomahawk in his head. Washington rides by, jumps off the horse and crushes the Indian, runs and jumps on another horse. This is like Rambo stuff, right, everybody? Washington saves half the army. And when he gets back eventually to Williamsburg, every man writes about this, saying we were saved because Washington did this, this, and this. And if there weren't so many letters, we wouldn't believe it. But what Washington does is Washington meets a widow named Martha Dandridge Custis, soon to be Martha Washington. And he writes her a letter. And in the letter, he has to explain his suicidal bravery on the battlefield. And he writes a letter that historians call it the Votary to Love letter. And it used to be printed in textbooks. They no longer publish it anywhere except my books. I put it in 2 books. Why did they stop publishing it? Because we found out the letter wasn't written to Martha, his fiance. It was written to the woman on the screen, Sally Carey Fairfax. Do you remember the hot rich neighbor? Yeah, he wrote it to her. Here's what Washington wrote. He goes, "For if I had died, it would matter not, because in your eyes, I would die a hero. I profess myself a votary to love." Gentlemen, Dean, are you taking notes? Dad, you taking notes? Some good stuff, right? I profess myself a votary love. If you read Washington's letters like I do, they are the most boring letters. It's like he didn't know what an adverb was. I mean, they're so bland. And half of his letters are talking about the weather. So this is really romantic for Washington. But I think that letter tells us something, and the fact that it was written to Sally. I still like George. I think he and Martha had a faithful, good marriage, but nonetheless, a surviving story, George Washington and the cherry tree. You all know this one, right, everybody? How many people were taught about George and the cherry tree? Come on, raise your hands. Okay, everybody, right. So here's the version. George's father, who's depicted there, is Augustine, who dies when George is a little boy, about the age of the boy here. Augustine Washington had a fruit farm. If you go to Mount Vernon, there's still fruit trees. And he bought George a little axe. Today, if you buy your kid an axe, it's news at 11. And you get a call from a lawyer. But Augustine bought George an axe, and he goes out and finds one of his cherry trees hacked. Now, the story says, Augustine says to George, "George, who killed, quote unquote, my cherry tree?" And George says, "What, everybody? I cannot tell a lie," right? Well, he was caught red-handed with the axe. "I cannot tell a lie" makes him a precocious little bugger. So what happened was that never really happened. That story, it's in a book. There was a preacher turned bookseller named Parson Mason Locke Weems, W-E-A-M-S. And when George died in 1799, Weems wanted to make money, so he got some professor type to write a book on Washington. It's this big book, no images, no pictures. Half the country is illiterate. Everybody's still broke from the war. He gets in a wagon because we didn't have Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble. He rides up and down the eastern seaboard in the wagon, doesn't sell many books. He loses everything. So Weems goes back to Philadelphia, his publishing company, and he decides, I'm going to write the book myself and make it all up. It sells. Around the 5th edition of the book, he makes up the cherry tree story. And guess what, everybody? We're still telling our kids in school the cherry tree story. I have a son and a daughter. My son's older, so when he was in kindergarten, I used to take him to school and pick him up. I picked up my son, Alex, and of course, he hears this stuff from me 24/7. Sometimes he goes to my speeches. He used to hear me on the radio and the TV and all that. I picked my son up from school, and he goes, "Dad." I'm like, "What's up, bud?" He goes, "You're not going to believe what the teacher said." I'm like, "Tell me, bud, what'd the teacher say?" He goes, "She said George Washington cut down the cherry tree." I said, "What did you say, bud?" He said, "Oh, I told her she was wrong." I'm like, time for a PTA meeting. Anyway, so I'll end with this one. I wanted to do one about Pennsylvania's own James Buchanan, our 15th president, 1857 to 1861, from Lancaster, right, everybody? Anybody been to Wheatland, his home? No one? Okay, I understand. I was going to tell you, if you go, the last time I went, the tour was inaccurate. But at any rate, so that's James Buchanan, old buck, and that's Ann Coleman beside him. So Buchanan was the only president never to marry. Now, Grover Cleveland, who was our 22nd and 24th president, 2 non-consecutive terms, which Trump's trying for. Cleveland served in the 1880s and 1890s. He was unmarried when he went into the office, but then as the sitting president, he got married to a 21-year-old girl, young enough to be his daughter or granddaughter, everybody. That's what you see down here in Boca, where I live. I always call it Boca family values. At any rate, so Buchanan was the only president never to marry. And I always thought Buchanan might be gay. Please don't misconstrue. My entire career, adult life, I've been a staunch, unyielding advocate for same-sex equality. I think everybody deserves rights. I don't care what anybody does, as long as you don't hurt someone else. Anyway, so Buchanan was engaged, and here's the story. Buchanan was engaged to Ann Coleman, and Ann's friends catch Buchanan in some hanky-panky. So they tell Ann, she's aghast. She sobs, she calls off the wedding. And she and her mother go to Philadelphia to visit her favorite sister. When they go there, the sister's going to take them out to the theater as a way of trying to cheer Ann up. Ann said, I can't go. The mom and sister go to the theater, come home to find Ann dead of an accidental overdose. They take her back and bury her in what was going to be her wedding gown on the day she was supposed to get married. How's that for a story? So nobody questioned why Buchanan never kissed a woman, never danced with a woman, never courted a woman, never married, because this story was so powerful. There's one problem with the story. It's baloney. Buchanan made it up to cover his tracks. Here's the real story, and I'll end with this. Buchanan was engaged to Ann because she was the wealthiest person in the state. Her father was loaded. Ann's friends caught Buchanan in hanky-panky, but not with women. Ann called off the wedding and goes to Philly with her mom. The sister and the mother go to the theater show. Ann committed suicide. Laudanum, which was a tea and an opiate, like an opium. Believe it or not, I found it was it still existed. The attending physician's letters. He said it was the only woman I ever treated who took her own life from hysteria. If you look at the roots of the word, it was a negative word about women that were crazy and suicidal. At any rate, so Ann was taken back and buried in the day that was supposed to be her wedding, but Buchanan wasn't there. In Buchanan's story, he stands over the body and says on the screen, quote unquote, my love is in the grave. I shall never love again. I shall never marry. And he didn't. The problem was he wasn't even at the wedding, funeral. He wasn't even at the funeral. Why? Ann's father said if Buchanan shows up, there's going to be 2 funerals. Ann's father sent men to hunt Buchanan down to kill him. Buchanan was on the run. So he made up this whole story to cover things. Buchanan had for 10 years a male live-in lover. His name was William Rufus King. When Buchanan was a senator from Pennsylvania, King was also a senator. I'm sorry if I smile. I love the irony here. He was a senator from Alabama. Alabama's first senator was openly gay. At any rate, Buchanan and King lived together for 10 years. The negative word for someone who was gay back then, like today, people would inappropriately use a word like fag or something. The negative word back then was Nancy. So Buchanan's nickname in the Senate was Nancy Buchanan. They also called him Fancy Nancy. And several senators and members of Congress would write that he and King, his live-in lover, would always walk into the chambers together with matching his outfits. They both loved silk stockings and silk scarves, and they would do them the same way and get matching pairs. And anyway, William Rufus King is dying of tuberculosis. His doctor tells him to go get some warm weather R&R. He goes to Havana and dies there. When I was in Cuba, I'm such a history nerd, I actually went to see the marker. But so Buchanan, I went through all 13 volumes or whatever it was. One of the worst things I've ever done in my life. I'd rather give blood at the Bloodmobile than read his letters. They were awful. But I knew I was going to find something if I kept reading. By the way, I'm not the only one. Doris Kearns good. Other people have written about it. But in one of his letters, Buchanan writes to a socialite in New York named Roosevelt. And he says to her that I've gone out a courting and a wooing gentleman. You all know what courting is. Wooing would be a hookup. And he said, I've gone out a courting and a wooing gentleman again, but I've again come up empty-handed. And he says, wouldn't it be something if I end up spending the rest of my days alone after King? But maybe I'll marry a woman as long as she never expects any physical intimacy from me. You know, so there's letters like that. There was one letter, Buchanan was touring a monastery in Europe. And Buchanan had a hell of a resume. He was in the House, the Senate, a diplomat, you know, lousy president. I've participated in, I think, something like 11 of the last 13 presidential ranking polls. And I used to always put Buchanan dead last. In my recent poll, I put him second from the bottom. But historians are in widespread agreement that Buchanan is a cellar dweller, a bottom feeder, no question. But Buchanan goes to this monastery, if you will, the cathedral, and he meets a monk. And this monk rocks Buchanan's world. And Buchanan writes the longest letter of any of his letters. And it is just, when I read the letter, everybody, I had to get a cigarette, and I don't even smoke. I had to light a candle and put some cologne on. It's really good. Buchanan, the monk's name, you ready for this? And your answer is, of course, that was his name. Brother Antoine. It's like the pool boy at the resort, right? Brother Antoine. And Buchanan writes, when Brother Antoine walked in, he said the light from the stained glass window reflected through on his chestnut almond beard, and his eyes glowed, and his full lips met mine on the European side, the way I've never been kissed before. And I said, be still, my heart. I felt I was going to pass out. He took me in his arms and I surrendered. It was like some porno magazine, so they tell me, right? I mean, it was ridiculous. So you can't always trust everything you read, everybody. You can't always trust the stories. I guess I would conclude by saying there's more we don't know than we do know. We got to keep digging. And it's an absolute delight not only to speak to all of you. I will come back to Hershey over the next X number of months, and I'll call Susan first thing, and I promise I'll do one in person. But it's an absolute delight to do what I do for a living. I've never gotten up and not wanted to go to work in 34 years. Every month I travel to a museum somewhere, a library and archives. I've never gone, oh, I got to go spend all day Friday, Saturday, and Sunday in the archives. To me, it's like a kid in a candy store digging up these stories for my books, for my classes, and to share with all of you. So thank you, everyone. Is there anybody else there I know? I know Susan and my pops and Dee. Last time I was there in person, I knew a lot of folks. Well, have at me. Any questions, Susan, or
Anybody want to ask questions?
Nikki, or?
He's not here, I don't think.
Covered it all. You covered it all.
I covered everything. Okay, if you talk long enough, and you've been putting up with that for 62 years, if you talk long enough, you'll cover everything. Well, we'll do this. I promise I will contact Susan and to my pops and Dean. Next time I come up, let's call the fellas, the old gang from high school, get everybody together. And I know that the Historical Center has several of my books. I think I signed some the last time I was there. I'll bring some new ones. The two new ones just won. One won a national, one won an international book award. So I'll sign those when I come back, and be happy to come back and offer another free lecture. Support the Historical Society, everybody. Susan and Nikki, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, now I need to go back to the beach and palm trees. All right, take care, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Really glad you invited us.